Let me just talk a little bit retrospectively about some of the things that were said here about what's going on around the country, because as diverse as the situation is, when we had the dog law put into effect in Pennsylvania, you know, we looked at it, and certainly it changed over time, but even after it passed, I thought, well, you know, this isn't a perfect law, but it's pretty good. And the more that I see about what's happening elsewhere in the country, the more I realize what a really good law this is. The only problem is that sometimes it's not applied or interpreted the way it was written, but that the law itself is actually quite a good law. And we're going to talk about that. And why don't we get started now that it's working?
Well, it's still not exactly doing what I wanted it to, because there's supposed to be another view, but you were getting my view and I was getting yours, so we'll just go. So I'll just start off with a little bit of an introduction about myself. I feel like this is an AA meeting and I can stand up here and say, I am a dog breeder. And I'm proud of it. And I work in my veterinary clinic largely with dog breeders. Again, I'm really proud of that. So I come at this from a whole bunch of different angles. I started law school 25 years after I graduated from veterinary school, and somehow Patty found me. So I ended up here, and I'm really honored to be here. This is one of my most recent litters of corgis. They're Pembrokes, if you aren't sure. And this is, it's a little hard to see, it's dark in the picture, but it's my husband who was just up here a minute ago with 2 lambs in his arms, a horse, a couple of cows, and a sheep in our barn. So this is really what we do. Now, I'm going to be a little self-serving here and let you know that at the auction there's going to be Wisconsin beer and cheese on the auction, and I extensively spent last weekend researching it. So I hope you appreciate that cheese is an important part of our heritage and in Wisconsin and in the U.S., and that's one of our agricultural products that I think we need to remember we need to support. So, Julian.
Yeah, well, you're not going to be able to see that too well, but that is actually one of our champion stud dogs with one of his get, and he is an intact dog, obviously, if he's a stud. And the get in that particular picture was just a pet little bitch who was adorable and cute and everything you would want in a pet, but she was never going to be shown. Okay,
so we're going to start off with a question of where we are now, and don't you kind of feel like that sometimes? We're going to then talk about language, crafting impressions using words, legislation or the use of the legal system, lobbying as a way to make progress, litigation regarding current events in dogs, and where do we go from here? So currently, the current legal status of animals is that animals are property, not people. So I think we all have pretty clearly covered that. And animals do not have legal standing to sue. I'm going to talk a little bit about standing a little bit. Laws restricting the ownership or the use of animals are in place to protect the public and to protect animals. Those include state cruelty to animal laws, laws passed to protect animals against unnecessary or unjustifiable pain, distress, or discomfort, and other state and federal animal protection laws. Some laws and regulations give animals positive experiences. AWA requires environment to produce psychological well-being of non-human primates, and there's regulatory and policy mandates for enrichment for many species used in research and kennels. My daughter does research, and they have very strict criteria on the kinds of things that they can do in their research. I was at the veterinary technician program training facility the other day, and they can do 3 venipunctures total on a cat. Well, gosh, you know, you take your dog to the veterinarian, and sometimes it takes 3 venipunctures to get a blood sample on one pet at one visit. So they're really overly restrictive and making it very difficult. She had to develop a new research program for a way to collect the parasites that she works on so that they could use the animals that they used for research on one more experiment, because it was really wasteful to have to do the things that they do. You know, they could only use the gerbil for one experiment the way that it currently had been set up, and then it had to be euthanized. And it just seems to me that that's so contrary to what we really want to have happening. There's significant limitations that exist on what damages the law provides animal owners, and there's generally no compensation for emotional distress caused by the negligent injury of an animal, although there is movement in this area, and that's a little bit scary as well. So I'm going to talk about language. One of my favorite things, like I said, would be beer. And this is an ad that was actually in Milwaukee. Only Guinness has 125 calories. Guinness only has 125 calories. And Guinness has only 125 calories. And this was, like I said, a billboard in Milwaukee, and it kind of gives you an idea of how just shifting one word can make a big difference in the perception of what you're saying. There's another example here of this cartoon says, look, he's found the scent, and he's holding a bottle of Chanel No. 5. So again, a way that words can be used, sometimes not so well. And please clarify item 14, have Mr. Birdie over for dinner. So the animal rights people have also used words in a way that hasn't been constructive. They've been equating some of these things, and you can just go down the list. Killing animals, they're equating to murder. Some of the pictures that Dennis showed shortly show that, some of the circus and rodeo things. So we have eating meat as cannibalism, circus and rodeo as gladiatorial contests, confining animals as kidnapping, purebred animals as racism, use of fur and leather as human skin, use of animals in research and education as kidnapping, torture, and murder. Lack of 24/7 access to water would be depriving children of care, and the ownership of animals equated to slavery. But if we look at how we can instead use language in a more positive way, we can call mandatory spay and neuter. We can instead call it forced sterilization. We have talked earlier today about overpopulation really being a retention or a distribution problem. No kill being limited admission shelters. Breed-specific laws can be equated to racism, discrimination, and bans. Humane relocation is really stray dog importation, or a lot of the other terms that we learned today. The small breeder, I love this, is an artisan breeder. It still uses the word breeder. And I think maybe we do have to rethink that. Puppy mills as substandard breeders. Animal companion and fur kids. I hear this at my office all the time. People call themselves doggy moms and kitty moms and dads. And that's a real problem for me. So we're really careful how we, just that simple terminology at the veterinary clinic, I'm going to take you down the hall and take you right back to mom. And I keep telling my staff, no, that's not their mom. That's their owner. Their mom has 4 legs and a lot more fur. Liberating animals can be anarchy or theft. Animals in research and education can ensure drug safety and train doctors, veterinarians, and other healthcare workers. I do not want the first surgery done by a medical student on me to be done on me. I'd really like to have had them practice a little bit somewhere else.
Yeah, and let me say about that too. It's not that we're opposed to using other means. If they actually do a program that they can do on a computer or on some artificial thing that is proven to give them the same experience and the same quality of knowledge, that's fine, but we're not there yet, and until we're there, we shouldn't be doing it that way.
So.
Okay. University of Pennsylvania, for those of you, since this is in Pennsylvania, derives its motto from the quotation from Horace, and since most people don't speak Latin anymore, actually that's not showing up there because we did it in black, and it really doesn't show up in black, does it? The translation is, of what avail are empty laws without good morals? And that, in fact, is what is going on here now. The animal rights movement is using morality to try to shape our laws because they know the laws are not going to shape our behavior. We have to believe, we have to feel what it is they want us to do in order for us to do it. And so they are doing things like equating words with certain kinds of negative morality to get us to act, or to get the public to act the way they want us to act. Go ahead.
Oh, that's good. So we're going to talk about use of the legal system. Go ahead.
Okay. Now, in the Western countries, the legal system is one of the primary mechanisms of social change. Our legislatures form laws, regulations which are enacted to make the laws work are created by agencies, and the courts then interpret the laws. And what's happening now is that there's a greater emphasis on animal law. You know, 15 years ago, you could hardly find an animal law course in a law school. Today, there are animal law programs in almost every bar association. Young lawyers are increasingly getting involved in animal law, and the side of animal law that they're getting involved in is not the side we would want them to be involved in, because they are ignoring all of the rest of the legal history of the United States. They're ignoring our constitutional protections in order to create law that protects animals. And this is not good for us. And, you know, this is the picture actually says it all. You know, they're going to take us for a ride. And that's what they're doing. Now, the courts themselves are really essential to the animal rights aims. And if you look at the diagram, basically, if you start in the upper right-hand corner, but it is a circular flow, most of the populace doesn't really want humans and animals to be equal, because we understand that animals can't, number one, tell us what they want. They can't make the decisions in their own best interests frequently, certainly in a society where we're all living together in groups. They may be able to do that in their own best interests, but they can't do it in the group's best interest. And what human society is about is evolving to do things that turn out to be best for the group and not for the individual. So if we don't want human-animal equality, then the animal rights movement says, okay, we've got to force you to want that. How do we force you to want that? Well, that's what we have laws for. And the laws in our society, if we can change them, can get people to act the way we want them to act and to behave in the way we have defined as morally correct. So after the law forces us to change it, one of the things we know in the psychological literature is that when your behavior changes, one of the things you try to do is to resolve the dissonance between your beliefs and your behavior. So you change your beliefs, because you can't change your behavior now because you're required to do it that way. And therefore, you know, whether or not we want it, we've got to sort of accept it, which takes us back to, they go on to another area. I mean, this is the cumulative process. And let me say one thing just parenthetically here. You know, Dennis is right that you don't want to compromise, but there's a difference between not compromising on your principles and not compromising in negotiating on a statute, because frequently there are things that are going to happen, and it's a judgment call that you have to make personally and individually on every bill. There are some laws that are going to get passed, and if the law is going to get passed, and it's going to get passed, and it's going to be devastating for you, then maybe for that particular bill you have to accept it. Let me give you an example that comes from Pennsylvania here. We had the dog law, which was put into effect in 2008. And I don't think anybody who was a rational thinker opposed the dog law as its purpose was stated, which is to make things better for animal welfare in large kennels that were breeding many animals, many of which, or some of which at least, were substandard. So the law they started the process, and the first drafts, and we won't deal with the regulations that came before it, but the first drafts of the law had a lot of things in it that would have affected sportsmen and would have affected breeders, in addition to large commercial kennel owners. And what we did was we worked, the Federation, the sportsmen, a number of other groups worked together to make sure that the law that was drafted did not negatively impact on us as far as the changes that were put into effect. And we were largely successful in that. There are two pieces of the law that basically affect sportsmen and hobby breeders. One is that you have to have a two fire extinguishers actually, in your kennel. And the other is that you have to have an exercise plan, and what the exercise plan is your veterinarian has to say that for the type of dogs you're breeding, they will get sufficient exercise if you do this. And if what it is you let them run in the field for a half an hour. If that's your breed, fine. You know, different breeds have different exercise requirements. You don't want an exercise requirement written into the law that says they have to have so many hours or so much, what a specific exercise is. That's the only thing that changed for breeders, and we got things put into it like you don't have to wear your license tags when your dogs are in your crate in the car and you're traveling with your dog, which is, for us, a safety problem because we know that the tags can get caught in the in the crate and create a health problem for the dog. So that was taken out. If you have a kennel license, you don't even have to have your tags with you. All you need is a copy of your kennel license. And there were a number of other things that we put into the statute that protected us. For example, you have a kennel inspection, they find a problem. Well, the original draft of the law said they could fine you. And we said, well, wait a minute. You know, this is supposed to be an educational process here. We want to improve people's behavior. So for all kennels except for commercial kennels, the first time they find a problem, they come out, they issue a warning. And you have a chance to correct it. And then they come back and inspect, and if you corrected it, no problem. Now, the problem came for the commercial kennels because they decided that this was going to be all or nothing. They were not going to give into this law at all. They were going to just work to stop it because they weren't going to compromise. And then, and some of you may have read about this incident, in Pennsylvania it is currently legal for an owner to shoot his own dog. And there was an inspection of a commercial kennel. The wardens ordered a health check, which basically gives the owner 3 days to get their dog to a vet and have certain things checked out to see if they're healthy. The owners apparently misunderstood the communication and went out and shot 60 dogs. And from that moment on, there was no doubt that this law was going to pass. The only question was, what was it going to say? And the commercial kennels still took the position that they were not going to compromise on this. They were opposed to it. They thought they could get the Senate, it had already passed the House, they thought they could get the Senate to stop it. And they were wrong. And the way the legislation turned out, in my belief at least, it is worse for the commercial kennels than it would have been if they had compromised on the language in the statute and tried to get changes that they could live with. So that's where we are. Okay. Do you want to take this?
No, go ahead.
What do the animal rights movement see as progress? They want to increase the way we think about the use of animals. They want to increase the effects of our feelings on animals. They want to, and a good example is the Feld case, where one of the claims was that the person who was party to the lawsuit was emotionally damaged because of the alleged cruelty that he saw in the activities that he was engaged in while working for Feld. And we'll talk a little bit about that later because when we talk about standing, because one of the interesting things in the decision of the court about the standing in the case actually was related to his claim of emotional disturbance and emotional involvement. Then they want to get animals that are of special importance to people to have some kind of legal status that is greater than the property status that they have in most jurisdictions. And once they deal with that group, I mean, for example, the great apes, For example, killer whales, which we all know are animals of special importance to us because PETA tells us so. They want to move on to greater personhood status, which will eventually lead to the equality, at least legal equality, between people and animals. Now, until an animal can tell me its complaint in a language that I understand, it's going to be a very difficult process for them to achieve. But that doesn't mean they're going to stop trying. They're going to keep trying. All right, what's the danger of where we're going to be heading? Why don't you take this one? This is your pretty slide. By the way, Patty said that this is the difference. This presentation shows the difference between men and women because my slide was much more, my draft was much more direct, much more simple. All the pretty stuff in here belongs to her.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I think it's more interesting.
I've sat out there a lot, and I know it gets long. So currently, we have laws that protect animals from unnecessary and unjustifiable pain, and no one's really going to argue that that's a problem, except, like I said in the previous example with my daughters and many researchers, is that there's limits that are put on research because of those things that really end up to being counterproductive. We also have laws requiring positive experiences or benefits for certain animals. In Wisconsin, we just passed a law that we have to have an enrichment program for all the dogs in the kennel. So like the exercise program that Julian described, it's written, and as long as you say you're going to follow it, it's enriching and they'll approve it. There's protection of animals from certain animal uses, such as educational exercises, and then laws recognizing special recognition. Pets in housing and animal trusts are some of the things that Julian had talked about. So there's a concern that with transition, we're now looking at legal standing for activist groups and advocates. And standing is a word that keeps coming up over and over again, and we'll talk about that just in case there's anybody left in the audience that, well, anybody left in the audience at all, but anybody in the audience that doesn't really understand that, because I didn't understand it before I went to law school. And awards to animal owners for their emotional distress. And this has been tried. I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard about the emotional distress issues. We did have a case in Wisconsin that almost went. It came very, very close. You can listen to it on the internet if you decide that you'd like to. And essentially, once you listen to it, you'll realize that the Supreme Court, Wisconsin Supreme Court, tried really hard to get this attorney to say just the right words, and they were going to let it go through as emotional distress. It was a Rottweiler that belonged to a neighbor of a police officer. The dog charged out of her yard toward the police officer. He pulled out his revolver and shot the dog, and then she tried to claim emotional distress. And there's, it's a very long case because, of course, there were appeals and all those things. But if you'd like to hear how close Wisconsin came, you can pull it up on the internet and listen to it. It's Rabideau versus the city of Racine, and it's disturbing.
Yeah, the other thing that this leads to, because there's an implication from this, since dogs are generally now considered property, if they have a special meaning to us, then other property can have a special meaning to us. So if you're a moving company and you drop my 50-year-old but chewed by my dogs trunk that belonged to my grandmother, and that has special meaning to me, as opposed to actually having a significant value that people can attach to it, then I can get more money for that, or at least I can now claim that it's worth more to me, which is, again, what happened in the Feld case. There was a claim that this animal had a special meaning to this person, and you can try and get that, increased damages for that. So it's got implications way down the road for our entire legal system if this ever gets through.
So the concerns are the future laws may lead to legal standing for animals, legal equality of animals with humans, and legal personhood where animals are no longer property. So legislation, how do we use the legislation, the legal system, and really it's up to you. And we know that you're already our advocates, but just to remind you, this is a little Simon and Garfunkel song for those of us who are old enough to remember it, and I'm one of them. So you do not want either Julie and I are singing this, so you'll have to read the words. But it really is a reminder that...
Yeah,
is it too dark? Okay. Okay.
You know the sounds of silence?
Yes. And in the naked light, I saw 10,000 people, maybe more, people talking without speaking, people hearing without listening, people writing songs that voices never share, and no one dared disturb the sound of silence. So, silence like a cancer grows, hear my words that I may teach you, take my arms that I may reach you, but my words like silent raindrops fell and echoed in the wells of silence. So we have to remember that, as we learned at lunch and as we've learned all day, that it's important that we all participate and speak up. So go ahead.
Now, states actually have animal rights laws because of our system, and it was mentioned before, you know, there's really hard to write a federal animal protection law, although God knows they're trying right now. They're certainly trying to take away, as was mentioned earlier, our rights to attend circuses. They're trying to take away our rights to have a website that describes our breeding program, because that's now going to make us a commercial kennel subject to USDA and APHIS regulation, if that bill ever moved. And there have been animal rights laws in every state. They have different levels of penalty in different states, and there is certainly a movement to increase the level of penalty for cruelty to animals. I don't have any problem with that as long as there's some rational relationship between the penalty and the behavior. And again, animals are property, and there's no law that says you can't do whatever you want with your property as long as you're not infringing on somebody else. I can't drive my car into your house, but if I want to take my car to a junkyard and crush it, nobody's going to stop me. I'm not suggesting we should do that with our animals, but again, it is your property right now. And, you know, we own our animals, and as was mentioned earlier by a couple of speakers, the goal is now to turn us into guardians of those animals, which has a totally different legal meaning. And that's one of the words, one of the word changes that they're working on to affect the way we act and the legal status of these animals. And so what we have to do is to make it clear that we are the owners of these animals. And you know, the quote that's up there is from one of the chief animal rights activists, spokespeople. You know, under the system now in existence, non-humans are owned, but we certainly cannot rely on the owner of the animal to act in the non-human's best interest. Indeed, the human-animal conflict generally arises in the context of a property right over an animal by the owner or someone acting on behalf of the owner in a community of equals. Community of equals, so animals, the assumption is animals are equal to us. Non-humans will not be owned at all. And if they're not owned, what are they? They're sort of free-floating agents of their own desire? I don't know. I mean, I know my dogs are several generations removed from being able to survive on their own in our society, out on the street, and I suspect that's true of many of our breeds. Some might be more successful than others. So if we follow the logic of the animal rights movement, then right now, the law deals in categories, which is people and property. There's nothing in between right now, although they certainly want to start moving that line. And the key impediment to equality between animals and people is that animals are property in the law. So they can be bought and sold. Oh my God, that's slavery, as we mentioned in this slide before, because they're buying and selling animals. And property, at least, shouldn't be the moral equivalent of the owner of the property, but they want to make it the moral equivalent. And property can be used, as NAIA supports, in a variety of ways. And there's nothing wrong with the use of an animal for human entertainment, for companionship, for any of the purposes for which we use animals, as long as we're not abusing that animal. And what they're trying to do is to change the basic definition of abuse, so that by changing what is considered to be abuse, they want to restrict any use of the animals, and all animals, and that includes, our favorite dogs and cats and birds and snakes and whatever. They're all property. So they really want to classify some animals, to start, as people or persons for legal purposes, which changes our legal system fundamentally in the way it operates. And then their goal is very much like successive approximation in psychological theory. You take one step at a time, and the closer you get, you then get them to that point, you move on to the next step, and you get them to that point, you move on to the next step. And they've already tried that with the great apes, with some varying degrees of success. As I mentioned earlier, they're trying it with the killer whales. Not everybody's favorite pet, but whatever works. And this is going to continue and will affect everybody, as people made mention of earlier. Anybody who's got any kind of animal for any kind of purpose, this is aimed at you. This is aimed at people who ride horses, people who enjoy rodeos, people who produce food for all of us, and food from various species of animals, and animals for companionship. They just don't want the animals there. And if you take a look at some of the titles of the books, speciesism is the same as racism, is the same as really bad stuff, guys. I think a rat is a pig, as a dog is a boy has probably been beaten to death, so let's just pass that one over. You want to take?
Sure. This was on my Facebook page a few days ago, literally a few days ago. It had happened last year, but this individual wrote to me, and she said, on November 1st, our precious dog, and this is not her real dog's name, so I protected the innocent, a miniature wire dachshund was minding his own business in his fenced-in yard in the city of Georgia is eliminated. He was savagely attacked and killed by our neighbor's 2 dogs. Fortunately, they were listed as lab and lab mixes and not something more scary. They gained access to the yard by breaking through the wood fence adjacent to his tiny, safe, enclosed yard. The necropsy concluded he was killed, mauled, and mutilated by these vicious beasts. He had been out playing for no more than 10 minutes. There is no way to express the tremendous grief our family is experiencing. There is no way to make sense of the senseless. We are devastated. As of the date of this publishing, the dogs are still living next door, running along the same fence that they broke through just 111 hours ago. No apologies have been forthcoming. Unfortunately, Georgia and most state law only recognizes our family pets as personal property. So this is written by her perspective. Yet almost everyone, including those who do not have pets, would agree our pets are literally a member of our family and engender far more emotional ties than a lampshade or a credenza, a bond that survives even after they pass from this world. As the law stands now, the owner of the offending dogs will more than likely go before a magistrate, receive a slap on the wrist, and move on with life as usual. Meanwhile, our lives have been turned upside down and inside out. Wilson was a wrongful death. The laws need to be changed to reflect this, not just by this state or county by county. They need to be nationwide. In the very near future, a fund will be set up for this little dog. She's planning to do this. He will make a difference, that he would not have died in vain, our wish for him to help all other defenseless animals that our laws do not protect. So although we understand this as an animal owner, as a dog owner, our hearts understand this, but really our heads need to tell us why a change like this could be really devastating. So this is really what happens out there every day. So moving on to our 4th topic, which is lobbying. We're going to talk about where we start, who do we talk to, and how we help our legislators understand. I love this. This is Pogo. Anybody remember Pogo? We have met the enemy and he is us. And sometimes doesn't it feel that way?
And let me also say, the most frustrating thing that happens to me is trying to get members of dog clubs to come out and get active in legislative activities. They all hate it when something happens. They all complain when it affects them, but they generally, it's impossible to get them to come to a legislative day, to get them to write their representatives, their senators, to do anything. And if we don't step up to bat, and you know this, and I'm not, like I said, we're preaching to the choir, if we can't convince these people to get active, we're not going to be able to win.
Okay, so we need to lobby our legislators, and we already know that if you don't do it, no one else will. Julian's point before was ask for everything you want, but any kind of movement in the right direction is progress. So don't consider that to be a failure. 3 is to hold yourself to be the expert. Be available to your legislators so that they're available, that you're available when there's a concern. You need to write, phone, email, and follow them up. And be in contact with their staff, because the staff is really the group of people who get you to the legislator. They often make the decisions for the legislators. They give them the right direction or the wrong direction. They give them a lot of information. And they're a really wonderful group of people, but you need to realize that you have to cultivate that relationship. And emailing isn't nearly as effective as walking into their office, meeting them, shaking hands with them, handing them literature, talking to them. Emails are too easy. Emails are so commonly done now that they don't hold the same weight as a handwritten note or a visit. And don't forget to donate.
Before you go on, Phil, I had a senior moment. What was her name again? Elsie? Yeah, okay. There's a story that I would like to tell you that actually I first heard from Phil, so it's his story, and I'm not going to do it the same justice that he would, but it really does demonstrate how important staff is. He was working for the president of the University in Louisiana and was on the legislative staff trying to track legislation that was going to affect the university. And he would go down every Friday, I believe it was, down to the office where they kept track of the legislation, and he would bring in a box of donuts. And he would drop it off and, you know, how you doing? And then just leave. And one day he got a call from the president of the university. And the president said to him, you know, there's this bill that just came out that we've got to find out because we're going to have some problems with it and we got to really work on it. So Phil said, okay, you know, he calls up the office to try to get a copy of the bill, and the conversation goes as follows. You know, they pick up the phone and he says, this is Phil Guidry. I work for the university and we need to get a copy of this legislation. And the woman on the other end of the phone, Miss Elsie, says, well, sure, if you come down in about 4 or 5 days, we'll be able to get you exactly what you need. And he said, no, you don't understand. We really need this bill because, you know, it's going to affect our funding and it's going to affect how effective we can be. And if we don't get a copy of it, you know, we're not going to be able to really address the issues. And she said, well, you know, it takes time to get all this information together and to make sure you get it to you. And he said, you know, Miss Elsie, don't you know me? You know, don't you know, can't you get this for me? And she said, well, now who did you say you were? And he said, I'm the donut boy. And she said, oh, come on right down. I'll get that right for you in a minute. No problem. And that's what it's all about. These are the people who are the gatekeepers. These are the people who control everything that goes on. I mean, when I was staff to the mayor in New York, you know, Ed Koch decided that he was going to give the inmates salad bars because that would civilize them and make them, you know. And we had this meeting, and he, at that point, I had gotten a promotion. I was in charge of actually food services for the Department of Correction. And he said, you know, I want to do this. I said, well, you know, Your Honor, first of all, these are meat eaters. You got to understand that, Your Honor. These are meat eaters. And second, this is a real security issue because they'll take apart the plexiglass sneeze shields, and they'll use them for weapons. And so that never went anywhere. The impact that a staff member can have on the progress of legislation is inestimable.
It always helps to take food to your veterinarian, too. Okay, so framing the issues. We want to talk about the audience needs to be able to understand what you're talking about. You want to introduce your vocabulary, because although when you throw the word bitch around in a conversation, you think that's okay, a lot of legislators aren't real comfortable with that. So you want to be sure that you're defining exactly what it is that you mean. What kind of events you're talking about, what kind of numbers you're talking about, those kinds of things are really important. You want to be truthful. You want to always take the ethical high ground. And you want to be able to use verifiable sources of information. And I think that a lot of the information that NAIA has been able to provide for us gives us that importance of being truthful and being able to pull up data that really supports our discussions. And Julian said we needed to include that anything you say can and will be used against you. So Cruella came to mind. We want to see that legislators have an opportunity to see us as a resource as we see ourselves. And this list of words was actually written by my breeder clients and a number of others. I was the chairperson for the Society for Theriogenology Breeders' Conference this year, which happened to be held in Milwaukee. And I handed them all a piece of paper and said, write down a word that you use to describe yourself as a breeder. So this is the list that they provided back to me, and then one of those people's names is going in the drawing for the raffle. So these are really terms that they think of themselves. And I think these are important terms that you carry forth and think that these are the valued skills that you have to provide to legislators and to other people in those positions, that you are committed, you are a resource. I mean, one of the greatest things that you do as a dog breeder is you're there. You're not out of the community, you're there when they need you, when they can't get the puppy housebroken, when they have a problem with it, when they want to start a new dog event, you're there, you're available to them. Instead of being an invisible person or an invisible organization that's not there. The rest stops are difficult to find them at again. So those are really important. So kind of remember that there's a lot of positive things that you can present yourself as, because I think we do get demonized enough that sometimes we forget that we should carry our heads high. Litigation. So what can be done when the laws go wrong if you haven't convinced the legislators to do the right thing? So where are we going now? Standing. We've talked about this a bunch of times. So without standing, which is the ability to sue, the animal rights movement cannot even try to convince judges to overturn the regulations and policies of government agencies. And I'm hoping that a few of you realize that standing doesn't mean you're outstanding in your field, that there is a term that goes with legal standing, and this is the actual definition of it. It's the ability of a person to demonstrate to the court sufficient connection to and harm from the law or action challenged to support the party's participation. So it has to be a connection, number one. Number two is that person has to be harmed or will imminently be harmed. And three is without that, the court will dismiss the case because they need to have something to lose in order to sue. So those are the things that all play a role in legal standing. Why is standing crucial for the animal rights group? Because without standing, they cannot haul regulators and animal users into court for expensive, time-consuming, and aggravating litigation. But standing for animals themselves will create this transformation from the property into persons, and then start that whole process that we've talked about. So what would happen if a pet could sue their veterinarian for malpractice for its own mistreatment? Well, it's certainly going to change the impact of, our cost of veterinary services are going to just be insane. What if a lab animal could sue its researchers for cruelty, or an animal, farm animal could sue its farmer for cruelty? This is not legal standing. Okay, so litigation if all else fails.
First of all, this is not the place you want to be. Because if you've gotten to this place, you're in real trouble. And you're also in expensive trouble. So just keep that in mind, because if you have to sue, it's going to cost you, as was mentioned earlier, big bucks. Even if you take a look, and most of you are familiar with the Murder Hollow case, it probably cost close to $100,000 in legal fees for that very small, what is really a simple case, but which set new ground in Pennsylvania courts as far as the rights of the person who was accused, because information was uncovered in that case, and she also, by the way, has instituted a civil rights action against PSPCA for the damages that she suffered. And PSPCA, it's already been decided in another case in Pennsylvania that PSPCA does not have governmental immunity, even though they enforce the laws of the state. So she, in fact, can recover if the charges are proven. So that's really important. There are a couple of grounds under which you can generally sue on a constitutional basis. One is due process, procedural due process, which includes that you can't figure out what the hell you were charged with. Either the law is not clear or they never told you, as we'll talk about the O'Neill case a little later, where that was very important. With respect to regulations, arbitrary and capricious regulations can be challenged fairly easily. You can't, unfortunately, I wish you could, you can't challenge a law because it's arbitrary and capricious, because legislatures can be arbitrary and capricious. That's what they're paid to do. Substantive due process, we'll look at that briefly, but basically it's not a real big issue, because I don't think you can demonstrate what you need to in a lot of cases to be able to pursue that avenue. And then my favorite, which is the taking of private property for public purpose, which actually, to my knowledge, has not been litigated in the way that I would like to see it litigated, although we may be on the verge of having a case that will do that. Okay, what is procedural due process? And this is a quote from the O'Neill case, quoting another case, but it actually describes what procedural due process is, which in order to establish a procedural due process claim, the plaintiffs have to show that, one, they had life, liberty, or property interest that was protected by the due process clause, that they were deprived of that protected interest, and the state did not afford them an adequate procedural right prior to depriving him of the property or interest. And warrantless searches certainly come under this heading. In fact, the Pennsylvania dog law is very specific. Although wardens have the right to inspect your premises, they do not have the right to go into your house without a warrant or your permission. Now, they can, under the law, if you don't give them permission because of their overriding governmental interest in enforcing the law, they can go to a court and seek a warrant based on your failure to grant them permission if you are a kennel, but they still have to have that warrant. And there are a lot of cases where, and Murder Hollow is certainly clearly one, the warrant that gave them access to her property was based on the fact that they saw her cleaning up dog feces. And to the best of my knowledge, that's not an illegal act in Pennsylvania. In fact, it is a required act in Pennsylvania. But some judge signed a warrant that said, you know, the ground looked muddy and she was cleaning up dog feces, you have to go and check on the animals. It just boggles the mind. There are also cases which clearly say that if the law, especially the criminal law, doesn't provide you with sufficient information for you to know what the hell the crime was, that you can't be convicted of it. And there's a really good case in Pennsylvania that illustrates that, where, which involved the shooting of a dog by a man whose girlfriend's son was bitten by the dog, and I won't get into the details of the case, but the fact is the law was unclear as to what it was that the crime exactly was, and a reasonable person wouldn't have had a clue that they were committing a crime in that circumstance. At least that's what the court found. There are also those fuzzy definitions. You know, your animal can't be too warm or too cold. Your animal must have sufficient exercise. Well, what does sufficient exercise mean? Now, in Pennsylvania, they said sufficient exercise means that a veterinarian who knows your animals, has looked at your animals, and determines that that exercise level that you have defined, that you define, is sufficient to provide for the health of that animal. That's at least a definition that you can work with. But if it just says your animal has to have exercise to keep it healthy, what the hell does that mean? Animals, again, animals must be provided with adequate food. Well, who is to determine what the adequate food is? Yes, obviously, if the dog or other animal is emaciated, you can say the animal is not getting enough food. But different breeds normally look differently. I mean, some are heavier boned, some are lighter boned, some have their ribs where you can see them when they're in normally good health, and some are well padded. You can't tell just by looking at the animal whether the animal has been adequately fed, and adequate veterinary care. Now, one of the, what does adequate veterinary care mean? One of the things that I don't like about the Pennsylvania law is that for commercial kennels, it says that you must, and this was put in, I think, for enforcement purposes more than anything else, because it actually has nothing to do with the health of the animal. Your animals have to have water at all times. Well, having water at all times, and we can get a veterinarian to testify to this, is not a necessary condition for animal health or for animal welfare. But it is part of the law. Now, since it's in the law, it's going to stand. That's hard to, it's clearly defined. It may not make rational sense from a veterinary perspective, but it is the law. So, when you're attacking regulations, and again, I'll use a Pennsylvania example, the Pennsylvania legislature decided in its wisdom, since it couldn't come up with exactly what the standards ought to be for health care for commercial kennels, they would establish a veterinary board which would write the regulations for these commercial kennels, and then the regulations would be promulgated by the Department of Agriculture. And if the regulation said that the animals must have water at all times, you could have attacked it as being arbitrary and capricious. But it's not a regulation, it's the law. Setting unachievable standards. The first draft of the regulations said that carbon monoxide levels, I think it was carbon monoxide, must be undetectable. The only problem with that is you go on the internet, which is what I did when I wrote my comments on the bill, and said, what does the EPA say? And the Environmental Protection Administration says 15 parts per million is normal in outdoor air. Well, excuse me, if they can find 15 parts per million in outdoor air, how the hell am I going to make it 0 in a kennel? And so that was changed. But that's the kind of thing you have to do. And luckily, we didn't have to do this in litigation. We could do this in negotiation, since it was a regulatory process before the regulation was approved, which is a hell of a lot better than having to sue. Now, one of the things that they also did, which the animal rights groups were opposed to, and if they had gotten their way, I think there might have been a lawsuit. The law said two things. It said that the dams could be with their puppies. It also said that the dams could not be on wire, or actually no adults could be on wire floors, but that puppies could be on wire floors. Well, now if the puppies are going to be on wire floors, and the dams can be with the puppies, but the dams can't be on wire floors, that means the puppies can't be on wire floors. That doesn't make sense. And the rules of regulatory construction in Pennsylvania say that where the same statute has different requirements, the agency that's involved in interpreting and enforcing the regulations can try to take those disparate elements and bring them together. So the department has said, well, you can have half of the enclosure with a solid floor and half with a wire floor, because that way the puppies can still be on wire, the dam can still be on a solid floor, they can move back and forth. Yes, we recognize that that's going to be the same, but it's clear that if you're going to have the dam with the puppies, you've got to do something other than have it all one or all the other. But if they had decided that they all have to be on solid floors, or all could be on wire floors, somebody would have sued them. The other thing is an unreasonable interpretation of the statutes. Now, this is one area where I think there's a shot that if the commercial kennels wanted to sue under the regulations, they could. The statute says that the commercial kennels have to provide normal diurnal lighting cycles. And the veterinary board decided that normal diurnal lighting cycles means 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness. Seems to me that maybe that's not normal, because what it does, in fact, is require the commercial kennels to provide lighting in the wintertime when it's dark outside, and to cover the windows. And natural light was one of the big things that was being pushed by the veterinary board, to cover the windows in the summertime because they have to be dark inside the kennel during daylight. So you might be able to argue that that's arbitrary and capricious. Nobody's challenged it yet. And the other thing, of course, is ignoring the statutory definition, and that actually ties into a case that we'll discuss partially later, because some of it was had to do with the statutory definition and the enforcement, where there was no statutory definition. Substantive due process. Now, the big area for substantive due process really is discrimination based on your group, and we really don't have protected groups that we're dealing with in dog law, but the biggest group that is generally excluded from the regulations that affect everybody else are the nonprofits. And there are some good reasons for excluding the nonprofits from some of the regulations. Clearly, if an animal is not going to be in a shelter for a long period of time, if they in fact are turning over, it's not going to affect the health of the animal to be in a slightly smaller enclosure for a brief period of time than it is if it's living in a kennel. But it still provides them with something that not everybody else has. And one of the things that NAIA has now successfully at least started to implement, we just got word this week that the Florida legislature has a bill before it that implements our shelter reporting project requirements, which is that all of the data that we're talking about being able to obtain from the shelters that are cooperating with us will now, if this bill passes, be required from all shelters in Florida, so that we will have complete data on the Florida shelters. And if we can get that bill pushed in other states, and I think it may be easier if we can get it done in Florida and they can point to the other states like HSUS does and say, oh, look at the law in Florida, isn't that great? You really ought to implement that here. And then try and get it implemented. We actually can get more complete and better shelter data. Because one of the most important things for our perspective is tracking those inter-shelter transfers. We had dogs that were seized in Pennsylvania that were then dispersed by HSUS to shelters in other places. We don't know what happened to those dogs after that. They may have been transferred to other shelters. But each shelter then gets to report them as a success. Because if you keep the dogs moving around the country, nobody has failed. The dogs were, transferred out. They were a save. And that's really disturbing. We ought to know where these dogs are going. Yeah, that's not going to help. It's my cold. Thank you, though. Deprivation of private property for public purpose. The real issue I want to take a look at here is mandatory spay-neuter. And by the way, we have a handout on lobbying, and one of the points that we make in there, which you can pick up afterwards, is that sometimes your enemies can provide you with support. And one of the things that I like to point out is that the ASPCA does not believe in limit laws. They say they don't work. Well, I don't care why the legislature won't pass a limit law. If I have to use the ASPCA's position statement in addition to ours to bolster my case, I'm going to do it. I'm not proud, and that's something that we have to keep in mind. We may be able to find support from places we least expect it, but support we can use. Mandatory spay-neuter, constitutionally, anytime your private property is taken for a public purpose, and I'm not talking about confiscations of drug busts where they take your car because you were carrying drugs in it, but if they take your dog, if they seize your dog and remove its breeding equipment, that is a partial, at least a partial condemnation of your personal property. And at least as I interpret the Constitution, hopefully as the courts will, if they do that, they've got to pay you for it. How many states do you think are going to pass mandatory spay-neuter laws if they have to pay you for every dog they spay and neuter? I don't think it's going to happen. I think they're going to back away from that real quick. But unfortunately, and somebody at the last delegates meeting at the legislative conference said to me, well, isn't there any way we can stop legislatures from passing these laws? And unfortunately, they're, except going back to the beginning and not getting them to pass them for logical reasons or for political reasons, there really isn't. They can pass any law they want, and once they've passed it, the only way you can deal with it is to sue them. So, and the other big area here, besides warrantless seizures, which everybody knows about, is the pre-conviction forfeiture bonds, which were becoming popular and which every time somebody asks me about them, I say, Louisville, read the decision, bring it to your circuit, because it's really very well written.
Julian, if they pass mandatory spay, if they get the dogs to have human equal rights, you can represent the dogs and reduce their, eliminate the spay-neuter, because the dog would go in and say, I'm not going to have forced sterilization.
The logic is there. The problem is the dogs can't communicate that. And that's the problem with them having standing. They, as much as the animal rights people think that the dog should have standing, it's clear to me, and I agree with you totally, that if you asked your dog whether they wanted to have an ovohysterectomy or whether they wanted to have their testicles removed, they would say, I don't think so. Thank you. I enjoy them very much. And as frequently as I get to use them, I would like to continue.
That's the male's perspective.
Well, is all I got to say. Okay. So where do we go from here?
Yeah, where do we go?
Where do we go from here?
Oh, yeah.
Well, we have two case studies, and one is yours.
I'm going to talk very briefly about this. In Greene County, which is in southern Wisconsin, there were 4 adults that were taken into custody, or actually not taken into custody, the dogs were taken. They seized 46 Great Danes from a home. It was multiple people living in the same house that owned the dogs, so they weren't all owned by one person. And 12 of them are puppies, so we have to kind of balance that a little bit. They said that the space in the sanitation was putting the residents at risk. So the Greene County Humane Society transported all the dogs to sites where the animals had food, room, and adequate sanitary conditions. This is where they took one of the dogs. It's a little hard to see a great deal of this, but this is a black Great Dane in a horse stall with a pen, with a crate. The crate had no crate pan in it, so if he wanted to go in the crate, he was on wire mesh, and a dog of this size on wire mesh is pretty uncomfortable. He had a bucket of water and bowl of food, and across the aisle from this dog in the same horse barn was another Great Dane that was pretty dominant and really stressing this dog. I took this picture. I was in this barn. I examined one of the 2 people's dogs. So I didn't see all 46 of the dogs, but I had my hands on most of the other ones. So this dog was living in this person's house and ended up in a stall, in a barn. And really, I'm not sure that we can say that this is adequate sanitary conditions. This is one of the other dogs that was there. She was pregnant when she was picked up. And when I saw her, she had no evidence of pregnancy on an ultrasound because I took my ultrasound machine, and she had a bloody vaginal discharge. And I declared her not pregnant, which seemed pretty logical since there were no puppies on the ultrasound. No one told us that she'd had puppies. No one told us she didn't have puppies. So I'm standing there, and if you look at the person who's holding the dog in that photograph on the left, she's wearing black pants and a gray t-shirt. She's pregnant. She told me she was pregnant, and I'm looking at this dog with a vaginal discharge going, okay, so am I holding a brucellosis vaginal discharge in my bare unprotected hands? Because those are my hands on the dog. It turned out she did have the puppies, but they had hidden the puppies, and they would not tell us that she had already whelped. We never found that for several weeks. We had suspicions of it, but we had no way to tell for sure because they had taken all the dogs to undisclosed locations and wouldn't let us see where the dogs were being housed other than the one dog that was in the barn because they couldn't get a leash on him. At that point, he was so stressed. So he went from being a happy house dog to being a barn dog, and this bitch had her puppies somewhere. So, turns out that the veterinarian who was called in on the state side, on the county side, was previously her veterinarian. And on the stand, we went through one picture at a time of every single dog that was picked up, and her statement on every single dog was, this dog is in good health. The next picture came up, this dog is in good health. The next picture came up, this dog is in good health. So it was a fairly interesting preliminary hearing. Interestingly also, if the sanitation conditions and the air quality was so poor in the house that they thought they needed to take the dogs, I found it strange that they left the cats and the child in the house. So the dogs have been released and things are progressing. So it was really quite an interesting group of events that happened with this one. So now we have Louisville.
Yeah, I'm not going to go through all of this in detail because you probably can read most of the decision. The important thing about the Louisville case, there are two things. One is if you read that and the Feld decision, you can get a really good idea of what standing is and the fact that the standing of a party changes at various points in the litigation. When you bring a suit, it's a lot easier to establish standing than it is after the court has heard testimony that may refute your claim of standing. So you can claim standing, get to the first stage, you then have a hearing, and the court says, gee, based on what I've heard, you don't have the right to sue. And that's one of the things that O'Neill stands for. The other thing that it stands for is that lawmakers really have to pay attention to what the hell they're writing. Because in Louisville, they did not define the term establishment. And in Pennsylvania, we did define the term establishment. So in Pennsylvania, it's clear in the dog law what an establishment is. In Louisville, they said that a Class A kennel is an establishment and that you had to have a license, but they never defined what the word meant. And the court, in the appeal after the initial dismissal, the appeals court said, well, they used the wrong definition of establishment. They used the general definition of establishment, and we looked at Black's Law Dictionary, and Black's Law Dictionary says establishment is a business. And these people had one litter. They're not a business. So they didn't need a kennel license, so their dogs were improperly seized. The other important point in this case, if it is applied in other jurisdictions, is one of the tactics that the animal rights groups use is the same tactics that the police use when they do drug raids, is you send somebody in, you see what you think is illegal activity, and then based on that, you can bootstrap the second group coming back in to make the arrest without a warrant. Except in this case, they didn't make an arrest. So the second group came back in. They confiscated the dogs, didn't write a citation, didn't make an arrest. And the question was that entry legal under the consent given to the original agents who came in? And the court said, gee, you know, you really need to have testimony on that. You can't just dismiss it because it could be illegal. And that's where this case is. So where do we go from here? Let me just make one other point before we close, because I know Patty didn't make it, and I really want to make it on our behalf. You know, we've got the animal importation regulations that were written, and that started a long time ago. The law took a long time to bring into fruition. The regulations have been in process for 3 years, and Patty has had a significant impact on the way those regulations came out to protect us and to impact people who are importing dogs for resale. And that's the kind of thing we need to do. It's a proactive stance. We have been reactive forever. And we can't continue to be reactive. We have to be proactive. That's what's nice about the Kennel Reporting Act. You know, it's a proactive step on our part. We're going to be involved in legislation just to catch up to where we are. So, yeah, you know, we're not out of time yet, but we are really close to being out of time. And it's going to take spending some money. It's going to take spending some time. But it's also, at the same time, we've got to work to make sure that those new laws that get passed are, one, not laws that we are opposed to, and two, we've got to develop our own laws that we support, that we can push for, that can protect our rights and keep bad legislation away from the future. And, you know, Albert Einstein was a smart guy. And what it says, because it's in black, nothing is more destructive of respect for the government and the law of the land than passing laws which cannot be enforced. And, you know, that's mandatory spay-neuter, that's limit laws, people go underground, they're not enforceable. So this is the contact information for, whoops, how did that happen?
That's okay, that's yours.
Oh, and this is my, now you do notice, because you can see, this is also one of our champion studs. He is an intact dog. You can tell. And how do we get this to play? An
ability of people to communicate with each other.
Turn up the volume in here.
Not particularly internationally,
Julian,
but especially emotionally.
Well,
So that what you see around you is people who are unable to love each other. This is called the sounds of silence.
thank you.
Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again.